How are we doing? So tonight, and I've been wanting to do this a long time, tonight we're going to do a reading of a translation I made with chatgpt, so take it for what it is, of this book. Now, this book is a book from a monk of Solesmes from 1975, named Dom Guy Oury. My French is not very good, so if I'm getting that wrong, I'm getting that wrong. And let me see. Let me get his biography up. It's Guy Marie Oury. Let's see. Can I just put it up? I'm going to boom her out. 1 second. Let's see. Oh, no, second allow. Well, whatever. I'll just read it. He was born in Tours. Guy Marie Oury entered Solesmes Abbey as a novice in 1947 and made his religious profession 2 years later. He was ordained priest in 1954. A professor of the Faculty of Theology at the Catholic University of the West, he was called upon to collaborate with Martina Monet of Saint Maria de Montaigne Abbey to complete the publication of the writings of Maria de Incarnation, Maria of the Incarnation, begun by Dom Jaunet in 1929. He was appointed chaplain of the Monastery of Nuns of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Westfield in Vermont County of Orleans in 1981. He collaborated with the Maria of the Incarnation Center at Laval University, with the Archaeological Society of Touraine, and with the journal Spirit and Life. He taught at the University of Maine in the United States. He was an author of more than 80 books and 200 scientific articles. He returned to Solesmes in 1998 with the title Father Master of Novices, where he died 2 years later of a cerebral hemorrhage. Some of his representative books include What Maria of the Incarnation Believed About the Incarnation and How She Lived Her Life, Mary of the Incarnation, the Mass, this one, Mass of Saints Pius V to now Saint Paul VI, the beginning of the missionary synagogue in Acadia, Terrain over the centuries, history of the church, the Benedictine tradition, prayers of all times, Dom Guéranger and Cardinal Touchet, Notre Dame Abbey of, can't pronounce it, it's French, County of Loch, the Saints of Touraine, the founding of Saint Marie and de Montaigne Abbey, and several other such things as that. So I found this in a set of books from the 70s. So it's interesting. The traditionalist problem has been a problem since the late 60s, early 70s. And you always wonder, well, why didn't the church deal with it? Well, the church didn't deal with it because it generally seems to have been dealt with on the continent in literature in the 70s that we just didn't bother to translate. So when you go look at old literature around this controversy, you'll see references to things, but it's always references to stuff in French. And this was, it's not the only one, but this is one of the longest ones in French by anyone, I would consider particularly competent. There's another one, but it's a little shorter, and I haven't bothered to translate it. And on top of that, there was no easy digital edition. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Now somebody said, I thought you were 40 years old minimum. Well, I'm actually in my late 30s, so that's not quite wrong. But no, I know I don't look 30 years old. Sorry, I know I don't look late 30s. Let's see. Okay, let me get the thing up itself. Oh, I've got an audience. I have 28 viewing, 20 on X. No, I should have done X more. 20 on X and 10 on YouTube, which is very good. All right, so let's go ahead and pull it up. No, not that way. That's all right. Okay, that's probably the best for reading. So the way I did this was I just went and fed the whole thing through chatgpt. You can look at my prompt. Maybe it's a stupid prompt, but I did try to. So, oh yeah, somebody says Giving me dire vibes. Yeah, I like my Hawaiian shirts. I have less unmanaged and unmedicated bipolar than Jay Dyer does, so don't worry. Anyway, so you can see my prompt. I designed it this way. The cool thing about ChatGPT when you're doing prompts is, when you're doing translations, is that you can indicate what kind of text it is, and I did my best to do that. So let's see. Usually when I read texts, I kind of do back and forth commentary. But, oh yeah, let me put my banner up. There you go. So, but if nobody says anything, then we're just going to do an audiobook. So enjoy that. I mean, I might stop every once in a while and go, you know, this, that, but I don't have anything in mind. So feel free to give questions. If you're on X, if you're on Twitter right now, you'll have to come over to the YouTube, which you can go through my profile and do that, because I can't, it's too difficult to monitor. You'll have to come over to the YouTube to interact. But usually I want interaction as we go, so that I can talk about what I'm talking about. That's the kind of point. What's the difference? Basically, the question is, when I do this, what's the difference between me do this and an audiobook? Because I could just get a robot or sit down and read it myself. Well, this is back and forth. This is the audience says some stuff, and then we go, and then maybe later you can come back and listen to this while you're driving around in the car. And it's really helpful, because the problem with audiobooks, just having audiobooks, is digestion. And so what does that mean? You need to hear it. And not only that, but the mind needs to be prompted to begin to think about what it's reading. And how you can, of course, if you're experienced, you can do that yourself to a certain extent. But really, you also want to go interact with the community and have people going back and forth talking about it. So you don't really just want your thoughts, because your thoughts will tend to get lazy and increasingly introverted. And so you do want to have some kind of community interaction. So it's, for me, the idea is to sort of provide a book and also provide steps in the digestion of the book. So that's part of what we're doing. Let's see. Oh, okay. Somebody did. That's good. Okay. John Thomas asks, queries. First and foremost, could you present the basic traditionalist contention that the author is addressing, perhaps either in his own words or yours? So it's going to be complicated. There's lots. So this book is, I'll give it here. Well, actually, can I? We'll jump it down ahead a little bit, because I have the table of contents. We're going to skip some of this. Oh, wait, I have an analytic. Oh, wait. This one has an analytical table of contents. I love my analytical table of contents. Oh, no. Did I GAMP myself? Oh, I GAMPed myself. Let me see. Oh, no. Oh, no. Did I boomer and not put it in here? I GAMPed myself, dude. It's over. It's over for me. And I got to go look it up. We're never going to get, it's just going to be me nerding for the next, don't everybody get ready for the content, because I don't know what I'm doing. Let's see, where is it? Oh, okay. Didn't take, no, that's English. That's English. Okay. All right. Let me see. Can I put this, can I move this over? Okay. I'll just have to, I'll just read it to you. So these are, and I could do it. All right, I'll do it. This is the way. Okay, I'll read the analytical table of contents and then the subparts. So chapter 1, the question for chapter 1 is, and I like this because he's from the era where you still have this. The question for chapter 1 is, was the new Missal regularly promulgated? And then the subsections are the reform decreed by the council, the first implementation documents, the normative mass at the Synod of Bishops, the Order Missal of Paul VI, merely authorized or mandatory for all, in France, the true thought of Paul VI on the matter. Okay, that's chapter 1. 2. Is the Missal of St. Pius V really abrogated? A. Then this is for this chapter. And these are the sections. A. The power of the church. B. Was the Missal of St. Pius V promulgated not to be altered? So that's going to be going over quo primas. If I'm getting that wrong, I don't know why I can't call it the correct thing to mind, but you know what I'm talking about, that 15th quo primum, I think. C. Is the Missal of St. Pius V really abrogated? D. Does the Missal of St. Pius V fall under customary law? So this is the power of custom argument, and that's old. That's as old as 1975 they were dealing with that. E. The permanent indult of St. Pius V. 3. This third question. The Ordo Missae of Paul VI, a testimony of an equivocal faith. So this is starting to deal with the doctrinal problems. A. The guarantee of the magisterium. B. The liturgy as an expression of the church's ordinary magisterium. C. Lex orandi, lex credendi. D. The institutio generalis. All right. 4. The Ordo Missae of Paul VI is not responsible for liturgical anarchy. So this isn't addressing a question. This is putting forward a thesis. So again, the Ordo Missae of Paul VI is not responsible for liturgical anarchy. That's chapter 4. A. The sacrifice of the Mass and the sacrifice of Calvary. B. The priesthood of the priest and the priesthood of the faithful. C. The presence of the Lord. D. The role of the Holy Spirit. E. The Eucharist and the Church. 5. The new Ordo Missae and the homogeneous evolution of rites. A. There is only one Roman liturgy. B. The development of the Roman Mass through the ages. C. The problem of the offertory. D. The renewed Ordo Missae. 6. The Ordo Missae of Paul VI and the separated brethren. A. Observers at the council and the concilium and the use of the Ordo Missae by Protestants. B. The true ecumenical thought of the Ordo Missae. So what I like about this book is actually you've got a defender of the Mass who actually wants to defend the ecumenical intentions of the era around the Mass and clarify them, which we don't get very much at all today. And then also there's Appendix 1. So there's also a lot of material I like about this book. So the Appendix 1, the phrase Mysterium Fidei in the words of consecration. So that's talking about, so that's going to be around the real presence of the Mass and the movement of the words Mysterium Fidei and the words of consecration. Appendix 2, Hoc facite in meum commemorationem, simple narration or celebration of the Eucharist. So again, that's about the change of the words of consecration. Appendix 3, the Eucharistic prayers of Protestant churches. So that's talking about, so that's the accusation that the Mass is reformed in a Protestant way. Appendix 4, the introduction to the Institutio Generalis of the Roman Missal. So that's the general instruction of the Roman Missal. So it's talking about the controversy over that, which is stuff. When by the way, if you have just joined me again, for this first time you've been seeing me, I have done some videos, and a lot of them have been, you just go do my streams and look at Manic Pixie research streams, okay? Those are me staying up at like 2 in the morning and reading documents on criticisms of the general instruction of the Roman Missal. So that's more of that. Appendix 5, you can see me just reading the Ottaviani intervention and very frustrated. Appendix 5. Some affirmations of the sacrificial character of the Mass in the prayers of the Missal of Paul VI. So that's going to go through the new Missal and start looking at the prayers and finding sacrifice in them, which is not hard to do. So you would think this controversy wouldn't keep up, but by God, it does. Appendix 6, the article by Max Thurian in LaCroix. So this is, if you've ever heard the slander, that Protestants thought that the new Mass was acceptable. Well, that all stems from an article by Max Thurian, brother of Taze, in LaCroix in the late 60s, early 70s. I forget when it was, he'll say. And Max Thurian, who eventually converted and became a Catholic priest, was a monastic brother of the ecumenical community of Taze, who has, for a Reformed Protestant at the time, I mean, he's living in a monastic community, for God's sakes, he had extremely Catholic adjacent views. I'd have to go through his work to show you that, but he thought that the prayers of the new Missal might be usable by Protestants. But what he had in mind was, and I discussed this in some of the readings I've done recently, what he had in mind is a community like Taze. And you also have to understand that this is a man who he not only defended the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist scripturally for Protestants, this also he defended the sacrifice of the Mass to Protestants in his own work. So we're talking about an extremely Catholic adjacent Protestant. So it's not fair to be like, it's not like primitive Southern Baptists were like, yeah, we could pray this. That's not how it was. It was totally different. And we'll go over it later, I'm sure. Probably not tonight, but we'll do our best. And then Appendix 7, the sacrificial aspect of the Eucharist in the Missal of Paul VI, and report by Cardinal Knox to the Episcopal Synod of 1974. So there was some church discussion over that, and that's a document on that. All right, so I think that covers it. Let's see. Okay. I don't think we have anything else. If anybody else wants to ask anything, ask it now, because I'm going to start getting into the book. And I mean, ask it during the book, of course, but if you wanted anything extraneous to it. So basically, after I start the text, basically ask questions, please. And if you're on X, please come over to YouTube and do that, because X is, I'm getting, right, let me be clear. I have 80 viewers right now, and 72 of them are on X. So come over to YouTube. It's River Run on YouTube. You can see it in my X profile if you want to interact. If you don't want to interact, if you don't want to chat, that's fine. But if you want to chat, come over to YouTube. In any case, because I can't monitor X. But what was I saying? Anyway, we're going to start in a second. Let's see. Let me pull up the translation. And I'm just going to read it through. Hopefully this isn't too unwieldy. It is what's on the screen. Okay. And we'll pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be made truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. Now, somebody has a follow-up. John's going to do all the questions for the rest of the night. Follow-up. The most common pop trad attacks usually center around liturgical anarchy and lack of sacrificial language, at least in my view. Maybe we deal with these first. We do deal with them, but I'm going to read through the thing. Also, very quickly, somebody asks, has anybody watched The Mass of the Ages Part 3? To my understanding, if somebody wants to tell me otherwise, because I have the video on it, if somebody wants to tell me otherwise, I'll look at it. But to my understanding, The Mass of the Ages Part 3 is primarily interested in sociological stuff. Basically, here are Latin Mass communities, aren't they nice? Okay, I mean, that's my understanding. And more or less. And traditionalist custodes is getting in the way, blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. I care about liturgical stuff and liturgical arguments and liturgical history and liturgical texts and maybe doctrinal stuff. I care, but I don't care enough to do work on it. I don't care how good or bad different communities are. I go to a Latin Mass parish. I have Latin Mass friends. I attend on a regular basis. So, I mean, I'm not, whether the Holy Father made a prudential decision and, maybe he ought to reverse or loosen it, or I don't know. That's a totally different thing. It's not in my wheelhouse. And if that's all that's in there, I don't have anything to say. Now, if he has strong liturgical content again, I'd be willing to look at that, but I'm not willing to look at, aren't these people nice and all that? I'm not interested. Okay. And one last one that's general and not on the text. Somebody asks my thought on the role of the acolyte in ordinary form compared to the role in the extraordinary form. Any tips for how servers should meditate through the Mass better? I mean, you should meditate just as you would, at least just as you would, as a layman, and that includes meditation on the content. I think that people should make their movements more seriously. If you want to look at that, I know one parish who does live streams. It's Prince of Peace Parish. I think it's South or North Carolina. If you look at their live streams, they show you how to do an ordinary form Mass well with good movements. Of course, all the papal Masses are done well with good movements. And I think anybody should be serious as anything you're doing in the Latin Mass. How to meditate, it's a little difficult. The only thing I don't like about the situation with the acolytes in the new Mass is that the way we reformed the opening rites and the prayers at the foot of the altar, the only content, I mean conceptually, not textually, the only content that we've totally lost from the Mass are prayers of access for the ministers. So the lay people don't get prayers of access because the lay people are not going under the altar of the Lord. So they don't need that. And the priest has prayers of access later in the rite. And so the loss of, I shall go into the altar of the Lord, who gives joy to my youth, etc., is not a big loss to him. He prays access later. You could say maybe he should pray it longer or not, but that's a different matter. But the ministers also used to participate in the prayers at the foot of the altar, and they were their only opportunity for prayers of access. And the ministers, as servants to the priest, do go onto the altar of the Lord, at least approximately. They're in the sanctuary. They're participating with the priest in the labor of the altar. They should pray prayers of access. And so one thing I might suggest, just is to pray the old, I shall go onto the altar of the Lord, yourself or with the other altar ministers in the sacristy before you come out. That's one thing that I think could be a total enhancement, or some other such sufficient prayer of access. Not as a priest, of course, but you're still going with the priest to the altar of the Lord, and prayers of access are appropriate for that action. Okay. Somebody asked, I get distracted, I'm so sorry. Somebody asked, what have you been working on a while? So I owe Andrew Lakutis an essay on defending the new Mass. And I got so lost in the weeds that I have not completed it, and I have owed it to him a long time. But it's because I get source obsessed, and it's an old bad habit I have in my writing. Anyway, I'm not going to get stuck on questions. We need to start the text. We're 30 minutes in, 24 minutes in. Also, tonight I got rum and Coke, and I've got coffee. So we're in it for the long haul. I'm going to do this at least an hour. I've read up to 3 hours on these. So, if you want to go to bed, just listen to this while you go to bed. If you want to be serious about the research, then that's fine. And if you don't think you can make it the whole time, you need to go. Again, these will be all on YouTube on the River Run channel. I've got 100 viewers. X is driving all of it. And again, one last time, and I'm not going to say it again. If you want to interact in the chat, come to YouTube. All right. Title is The Mass from St. Paul V to Paul VI. If I was to publish this, I would probably change the title from the Mass from St. Paul V to St. Paul VI, because he's canonized now. By Dom Guy Oury, monk of Solesmes, 1975. Foreword. For 6 years now, controversies have continued around the Missal of St. Pius V. The articles and even the works published on this subject, notably those of Mr. Celerion and Mr. da Silveira, would suffice to make up a small library. Often, their authors assert that they have yet to receive any relevant response that truly refutes the arguments they have put forward. Therefore, it seems necessary, beyond any spirit of controversy, to compile a succinct work proposing the essential answers that can be offered to those who are painfully preoccupied with this problem. Firstly, canonical responses showing that the Missal of Paul VI was regularly promulgated, 1, and that of St. Pius V is no longer legitimately in use except in a few specific cases provided for by law, 2. Theological responses thus, firstly, the fundamental response drawn from the necessary rectitude of the faith of the Roman Church and its expression in public prayer, guaranteed by the ordinary magisterium, 3. Then a series of more analytical responses comparing the faith defined at Trent and the expression of it found in the Novus Ordo Missae, 4. Liturgical responses demonstrating from the historical evolution of the rites of the Roman Mass how the recent reform is justified and how the Novus Ordo Missae fits without real rupture into the liturgical tradition of the Roman Church. My translation chose New Ordo Missae. That is not the usual way to do this in these texts, so I'm going to verbally change it to Novus Ordo Missae. But it's the Novus Ordo, the new order of the Mass. Just remember, Novus Ordo Missae means new order of the Mass. That's what we're looking at. Finally, a response to those who question the orthodoxy of the Novus Ordo Missae due to the ecumenical intention that is alleged to have presided over its development. 5. The appendices are intended as follows: to justify, through a comparative study of liturgies, some modifications introduced in the Eucharistic prayer, the insertion of the Mysterium Fidei, or the movement of it, the hoc facite in meum commemorationem, appendices 1 and 2, to provide some documents that seem enlightening comparison of the Protestant Eucharistic prayers currently in use with the new Roman canons, preface of the Missal, texts attesting to the Church's enduring faith in the sacrificial and propitiatory character of the Eucharist, appendices 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. May these pages be useful to those who believe that the Church cannot fail in its faith and that the assistance of the Holy Spirit has been promised to it until the end of time. There's special acronyms and difficult to translate terms. I'm not going to go through the acronyms. If you want to go through all that, the URL for this again is on YouTube. But there are some difficult terms, and I will read those. Canon, literally rule of the Eucharist, refers to the Eucharistic prayer in its entirety. Anaphora, literally offering, refers to the Eucharistic prayer in the Eastern tradition. Eucharistic prayer, the central and essential part of the Mass celebration, beginning with the preface dialogue and ending at the conclusion of the canon before the Pater, our Father. Epiclesis, literally invocation of the Holy Spirit, a prayer requesting either the consecration of the bread and wine or the fruitful reception of the sacrament. Anamnesis, literally memory or remembering. He doesn't say that, I do. The part of the Eucharistic prayer that follows the consecration and makes memory of or memorial of the passion, resurrection, glorification of Christ and his return at the end of times. Intercession, the recommendation to God of the Church's intentions in the Eucharistic prayer, so that the fruits of the Eucharistic sacrifice may be applied to all, even non-communicants. Doxology, literally glorification, a prayer of adoration and praise addressed to the three divine persons. Rites, gestures, words, sacred ceremonies used in the liturgy. Rite, a particular liturgy, Milanese, Leonese, Hispanic or Mozarabic, Gallican, Celtic, Byzantine, Antiochian, etc. Chapter 1. Was the new Missal regularly promulgated? In the Apostolic Constitution, Divino Afflato, through which he promulgated the new arrangement of the Psalter, November 1, 1911, Pope St. Pius X stated that, in doing so, he embarked on the path of revising the breviary and the Missal of St. Pius V. Here are his own words on the matter thus: the arrangement of the Psalter, being intimately linked to the entire divine office and to the liturgy, it is clear that, by the decisions taken here, we have made a first step toward the correction of the Roman breviary and Missal. For this work, we will soon establish a special council, as it is said, a commission of scholars. The reform was modest. However, it is significant that this great pope did not consider the work of St. Pius V to be definitive and unreformable. This was also the thinking of Pius XII, as he profoundly reworked not the entire Missal, but what constitutes the heart of the liturgical year, that is, the celebration of the Paschal Mystery. The reform decreed by the Council. It is in the wake of this reform that Articles 50 to 58 of the Conciliar Constitution on the Liturgy, solemnly promulgated by Pope Paul VI on December 4, 1963, at the closure of the second session, are situated. Without reproducing them in their entirety, it seems necessary to at least provide some excerpts and an analysis. They attest that the Fathers of the Council, following in the footsteps of St. Pius X and Pius XII, did not think that the Missal of St. Pius V constituted the final ne veritur, state, that is not to be changed, state of the Roman liturgy. I'm not going to get the official translations. If I was to publish this translation, I would get the official translations, or at least the ones in usual use. There aren't ones that you have to use. I mean, I'd have to see. I don't know what in is whether the ones on the Vatican website are the ones in scholarly use or not. Article 50. The ritual of the Mass will be revised in such a way that the unique role and mutual connection of each of its parts become more apparent, and that the active participation of the faithful is facilitated. Therefore, while faithfully preserving the substance of the rites, they will be simplified. Those that have been duplicated over the ages or added without much utility will be omitted. Certain elements that have disappeared over time will be restored according to the ancient norm of the Holy Fathers, to the extent that it appears appropriate or necessary. Without delving too deeply into the details, the Conciliar Constitution then outlines the broad strokes of the reform, that is, greater variety of biblical readings spread over a number of years to be determined, Article 51. Emphasis on the importance of the homily, Article 52. Restoration of the universal prayer, Article 53. Possibility of communion under both kinds, Article 55. Concelebration, Articles 57 to 58. Finally, the fundamental unity of the rites of the Mass was affirmed thus, Article 56. The two parts that in some way constitute the Mass, namely the liturgy of the Word and the Eucharistic liturgy, are so closely united with each other that they form a single act of worship. Okay, so what did he lay out? Remember, we're asking the question, does the Church consider the Missal irreformable? Well, according to the Council, Sacrosanctum Concilium, Article 50 through, we just went through Article 50 through 56. No, obviously the Church does not consider it irreformable. The Council considered it reformable. And then what did it call for? That is to say, what did Sacrosanctum Concilium call for? Sacrosanctum Concilium called for the revision of the ritual of the Mass revised in such a way that the unique role and mutual connection of each of its parts become more apparent, that the active participation of the faithful be facilitated, that the substance of the rites be preserved, that they be simplified, that rites that have been duplicated over the ages or added without much utility be omitted, that certain elements that have disappeared be restored, according to the ancient norm of the Holy Fathers, to the extent that it appears appropriate or necessary. Moreover, a greater variety of biblical readings spread out over a number of years to be determined, emphasis on the importance of the homily, restoration of the universal prayer, we sometimes call it the prayer of the people, the Lord hear my prayer part, the possibility of communion under both kinds, that is to say, communion of bread and wine, concelebration of priests. Finally, the fundamental unity of the rites of the Mass was affirmed, that is to say, that the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy and the Eucharistic liturgy are not to be separated, that they're a unit. The first implementing documents. Subsequently, two stages can be distinguished in the implementation of the reform. The first was essentially transitional, that is, it involved a series of simplifications concerning the rubrics of the existing books. During this time, the proper reform of the liturgical books continued. The publication of these would mark the beginning of the second stage. Indeed, a progressive reform was opted for from the first implementing decrees. Whether the advantages of this system always managed to compensate for the practical disadvantages is for others to say. The following documents pertain to the first stages. The Motu Proprio Sacrum Liturgicum of January 25th, 1964. The Instruction Inter Oecumenici of September 26, 1964. The Revised Order Missae and Ritus Servandus of January 27, 1965. The Instruction Tres ab hinc annos of May 4th, 1967. The new, quote, Variationes in Ordine Missae Inducende, of May 18th, 1967. The second stage began with the promulgation of the Ritus Servandus in Concelebratione Missae of March 7, 1965, followed by the decree promulgating the 3 new Eucharistic prayers and 8 new prefaces on May 23, 1968. Finally, there was the Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum, signed by the Holy Father on April 3, 1969, at the conclusion of the development of the Order Missae. This was followed by the typical Latin edition of the new Missal and that of the lectionary in the subsequent months. 2 very important reforms concerning the very rite of the Mass had therefore preceded the new Order Missae by the first 5 years, the second by 11 months, without raising any particular problem or controversies. However, the introduction into the Roman liturgy of new Eucharistic prayers was a significantly more important event than the suppression of the so-called devotional prayers recited by the priest in a low voice at the offertory and communion. For the Roman canon had been the sole rule of the Eucharistic celebration, with few modifications, practically since the 5th century. But during the 11 months when the use of these new canons was authorized before the promulgation of the renewed Order Missae, their perfect orthodoxy was not questioned, which, moreover, should always have been the case. So remember, he's going over, look, we were doing reforms for quite some time. It was not, in other words, the new Order Missae did not jump out of the bushes and get us. We did reforms in 1964, 1965, 1967, 1968, 1969, and the orthodoxy was not questioned until we got to the promulgation of the Mass. The so-called normative Mass at the 1967 Synod. On the other hand, Discussions had already arisen regarding the first draft of the Order Missae presented at the Episcopal Synod of 1967. This project was given the name Normative Mass, a term that was misunderstood at the time. This did not mean that masses other than the normative mass celebrated in the presence of the people with active participation of ministers and the assembly, were abnormal. The intent was that this type of mass would serve as a reference, and other modes of celebration would be organized around it. In the Missal of St. Pius V, the true so-called normative mass was, in fact, the Episcopal Mass sung with the participation of numerous ministers, a choir, and the assembly, and not the low mass, entirely said by the priest, as most of the faithful witnessed it being celebrated. On October 24th, 1967, in the Sistine Chapel, the fathers of the Synod thus attended a so-called normative mass, celebrated in Italian by Father Bugnini, then secretary of the so-called Concilium for Liturgy. The celebration lasted 55 minutes. Following this so-called experimentation, entirely regular, since the Pope himself had requested it, a number of questions were posed to the fathers, namely 4 on October 25th and 8 on October 27th. Here are the ones concerning the Mass. On October 25, 1. Do the fathers find it appropriate that, in the Latin liturgy, 3 other Eucharistic prayers be added to the Roman canon, which remains unchanged? Votes. Placet, that is, yes, accepted. Placet, 127. Non-placet, no. 22. Placet juxta modum, 34. So placet juxta modum is basically yes with certain reservations. So yes, but I've got a comment. Do the fathers agree that in these new Eucharistic prayers, the formula for the consecration of the bread should be, "This is my body given up for you"? Placet, 110. Non-placet, 12. Placet juxta modum, 61. Do the fathers find it appropriate that in the new Eucharistic prayers, the incise Mysterium Fidei be removed from the formula of consecration of the wine? Placet, 93. Non-placet, 48. Placet juxta modum, 42. Do the fathers deem it appropriate to give the episcopal conferences the authority to decide whether to replace the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed with the Apostles' Creed? Placet, 142. Non-placet, 22. Placet juxta modum, 19. On October 27th, the questions and votes were as follows. Does the general structure of the so-called normative mass, as described in the report and the response, have the approval of the fathers? Placet, 71. Non-placet, 43. Placet juxta modum, 62. Abstentions, 4. Do the fathers approve that the mass always includes a penitential act, varied in its forms and according to the liturgical seasons, in which all the faithful participate? Placet, 108. Non-placet, 23. Placet juxta modum, 39. Abstentions, 10. Do the fathers approve that, for an experimental period, the Mass includes 3 mandatory readings, so that after this probationary period, and based on pastoral experiences, the question of the number of readings can be satisfactorily resolved? Placet, 72. Non-placet, 59. Placet juxta modum, 41. Abstentions, 8. 4. Do the fathers approve that the antiphons of the entrance, offertory, and communion may be replaced by appropriate songs according to the judgment of the episcopal conferences and with texts they have approved? Placet, 126. Non-placet, 25. Placet juxta modum, 19. Abstentions, 10. The first set of questions concerning the Eucharistic prayers was overall received more favorably than the second, but a placet juxta modum is not a non-placet and does not add up to the total of unfavorable votes. Placet juxta modum means exactly yes, comma, to a certain extent, or yes, but, or yes, with reservations for some aspect of the question. When the revised project has been taken into account, the expressed modi, the vote placet juxta modum, normally becomes an unrestricted placet. It should be added that in most projects conceived by even eminent men, the solution proposed by a group, a commission, cannot receive unconditional approval. Every text, every draft law, even accepted in principle, must receive amendments from those responsible. The opposite would be concerning. Finally, the so-called concilium addressed the reservations expressed by the fathers. For example, the Mass does not always include a penitential act, and this does not necessarily model itself on the liturgical seasons. The Mass does not always include 3 mandatory readings. The ferias, memorials, and feasts only include 2, and the Episcopal conferences enjoy a certain latitude to dispense with the 3rd on Sundays and solemnities. The incised Mysterium Fidei has remained in the liturgy of the Mass in the immediate vicinity of the words of the consecration of the chalice. Therefore, it is not accurate to say that the Synod and the Pope disapproved of the normative Mass and that it resurfaced 2 years later through a clever sleight of hand unknown to the sovereign pontiff. It served as a working schema. It was not adopted as it was. And so, John is asking, wow, so they were basically happy to change the Nicene Creed to the Apostles' Creed? That's weird. You can, let me look, I'll pull it up on Universalis. You can, even to this day, you have the option of substituting, option of substituting the creed for the Apostles' Creed on, let me see if is it every Sunday or any time or certain feasts? I forget. Let me see. Can you do it on Easter Sunday? That would be the real test. That's the Gloria. Gospel, the Creed. You can substitute the Apostles' Creed anytime the Creed appears. Most parishes don't do it, but it is an option. And apparently you, at least according to Universalis, which is usually pretty accurate on the rubrics, it's allowed even on Easter, which I just looked, I just checked. But it's an option, so it was not the removal of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. It was the allowance of substitution. Anyway, what was I saying? So right now he's addressing certain, where if you've read the Ottaviani Intervention, or the short critical study of the New Order of Mass, right now he's addressing the beginning. And I've gone over this. Please, go on my YouTube and look at my live streams on the Ottaviani Intervention, on Cicada's summary of the Ottaviani Intervention, and on some other texts around the Ottaviani Intervention. Because right now we're at the beginning of the Ottaviani Intervention, where he says that, this is the first paragraph or two, or first pages anyway, where he's basically saying that the new order of the Mass was irregularly promulgated simply because they didn't pay any attention to the fathers of the 67 Synod. It didn't pay any attention to the will of the Church, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we're talking about right now. And he said, no, it did. First of all, the fathers of the Synod, of the 67 Synod, approved it. And the placet juxta modum objections were handled. And I've discussed this before. I've gone over them in detail because they're in Bugnini's book as well. But they were addressed. And the idea that because there was some contention on October 27th, therefore it was irregular, that's not appropriate. Okay. The Order Missae of Paul VI. On Holy Thursday, 1969, with the new Order Missae ready and the Missal about to be published, Pope Paul VI promulgated both, the latter by anticipation, through the Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum, April 3rd, 1969. The Papal Act praises the Missal of St. Pius V, and this praise does not have the tone of a eulogy. It could not be otherwise, since many of its elements are included in the composition of the renewed Missal, enriched with contributions from numerous ancient sources, still inaccessible at the time when St. Pius V conducted his own revision. Throughout its 4-century existence, the Missal of St. Pius V has borne numerous fruits. It has spiritually nourished generations of Christians and spread to the most distant regions due to the foundation of new churches. It has been a sign and a powerful factor of unity, a link among all Catholics of the Latin Rite. Let us quote the last paragraph of the Apostolic Constitution in a translation that aims to be very literal in order to not betray the Pope's thought. The passage has indeed provoked controversies. Again, I'm not pulling from the official text, so we'll just have to deal with the machine translation of the French. If I was to do this again, in a publication, I would pull an official text. To conclude, what we have set forth about the new Roman Missal, it pleases us to deduce and clarify a particular point. Quididam. Here is the point. When our predecessor, St. Pius V, promulgated the first edition of the Roman Missal, he presented it to the Christian people as a tool, instrumentum, of liturgical unity and as a sign, signum, of authentic worship in the Church. Similarly, although by mandate, de mandato, of the Second Vatican Council, we have adopted in this new Missal the possibility of legitimate differences and adaptations, we are nonetheless confident that it will be received by the faithful as an aid to testify to and strengthen mutual unity. Thus, through the great diversity of languages, a single and unique prayer will rise to the Father in heaven through our Supreme Pontiff Jesus Christ in the Holy Spirit, like incense of a pleasing odor. Here is inserted an incise that is not found in the first printed booklet containing the Ordo Missae, but only in the text published shortly after in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, official journal of the Holy See, and subsequently in all editions of the Missal. This present constitution we prescribe to come into force from November 30th of this year, that is, the first Sunday of Advent. The conclusion of the Apostolic Constitution, however, is identical in all printed copies. That is, we want what we have decided and ordered to be recognized as firm and effective today and in the future, notwithstanding, if necessary, the constitutions and apostolic ordinances given by our predecessors and all other prescriptions, even worthy of special mention and derogation from the law, given at Rome near St. Peter on April 3rd, 1969, Holy Thursday, the 6th year of our pontificate. The absence of the incise indicating the date of entry into force of the Constitution, the first edition of the Ordo Missae, does not have the importance attributed to it, as the date is indicated in the decree of the Congregation of Rites, which is annexed to the Constitution and placed at the beginning of the Ordo Missae. Much has been debated about the absence of this clause in the first published booklet containing the Ordo Missae. According to some, the Apostolic Constitution of Paul VI was audaciously completed by its French translator and would therefore be a fake. In reality, the authentic text of the Apostolic Constitution, the authoritative one to which we must refer, is the complete text published in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis. It is certainly the law, according to the usual norms. The Latin text containing the clause is to be compared, all proportions observed, to the enacting terms of laws as intended in our official journal. The Holy Father has clearly expressed in the constitutive act itself, the Apostolic Constitution, his will to legislate and therefore legally oblige. The same will is also expressed in the decrees of the Congregation for Divine Worship, published de speciale mandato, which are annexed either to the Ordo Missae or to the complete Missal. So if you don't know what this is about the old dispute, which is at this point moot, irrelevant. This is the old dispute about whether the old Mass was abrogated and whether the new Mass was mandated. That's what we're talking about. And that dispute is now irrelevant, but it used to come up all the time. For a simple decree of the Congregation of Rites would have sufficed to promulgate the Ordo Missae, That is, Pius XII had the new liturgy of the Holy Triduum promulgated by a simple decree of the Congregation of Rites on November 16, 1955, therefore modifying a very important part of the Missal of St. Pius V. John the 23rd had the second part of the Roman Pontifical, containing the rites of consecration and blessing of sacred places and objects of worship, promulgated by a simple decree of the Congregation of Rites on April 1st, 1961, notwithstanding the bull Ex Quo in Ecclesia Dei of February 10th, 1596, stating that at no time can any changes, additions, or omissions be made to this book. Paul VI himself frequently used this procedure. See especially Ordo Pinatiae, Ordo Professionis Religiose, Ordo de Sacro Communiae, etc. It is known that St. Pius X modified by the Apostolic Constitution Promulgated of September 29, 1906, the mode of promulgation of the Church's laws thus. We desire, he said, that the pontifical constitutions, laws, decrees, and other notifications, both from the sovereign pontiffs and from the sacred congregations and offices, be inserted and published in the acta, and for this sole and unique reason, that they be held as legitimately promulgated whenever promulgation is necessary or when it has not been otherwise disposed of by the Holy See. What if my John adds, I need to sleep, but I would definitely love to see this polished and sent to print, as it seems like a very good resource on the Novus Ordo and the controversy around it that still exists today. Yeah, I would love to publish it. I tried to get a hold of Solesmes to get rights to publish a translation, but I didn't get a contact. If anybody has a direct contact to Solesmes, other than the query thing on their website and a couple other things, please let me know. The method of promulgating laws is therefore at the discretion of the sovereign pontiff. The laws must be received by the faithful, regardless of the mode of their promulgation and their legal form. In any case, the absence of the incise, this present constitution, does not transform said apostolic constitution into a dubious law and therefore non-existent, since it is accompanied by a decree of the Congregation of Rites which would suffice on its own and which provides details on the date of application. Thus, having renewed the Ordo Missae in accordance with the decisions of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, and having received the approval of the Sovereign Pontiff by the Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum, given on April 3, 1969, this sacred congregation, by special mandate of the Sovereign Pontiff, promulgates the said Ordo Missae, decreeing that it will begin to come into force from November 30th of this year, 1969, the first Sunday of Advent, etc., given on April 6, 1969. The decree is signed by Cardinal Gut, prefect of the Congregation of Rites, and countersigned by the Secretary Monsignor Antonelli. From these documents, it cannot be contested that the Ordo Missae was truly promulgated. The Ordo Missae indeed came into force in the Latin text of the typical edition on November 30th, 1969. Merely permitted or obligatory for all? So now we're going to ask the question about whether it was permitted or obligatory for everyone. An instruction from the Congregation of Rites on October 20th, 1969, provided further clarification on the implementation of the Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum. The deadlines imposed by translation work and the publication of texts in vernacular languages made it impossible to synchronize the implementation of the reform across different linguistic areas. Among other provisions, it reads as follows. Regarding the Ordo Missae, from November 30th, 1969, the Latin text of the renewed Ordo Missae may be used. The Episcopal conferences will determine the day from which the Ordo Missae may be used with texts in the vernacular languages. The various Episcopal conferences will decide the day when it will be obligatory to use the Ordo Missae, except in cases provided for below. This day cannot be postponed beyond November 28, 1971. These three paragraphs are perfectly clear. For the Ordo Missae, not for the Missal itself, whose typical edition was not yet commercially available at this date, the Episcopal conferences received a mandate from the Holy See to determine the date on which the new Ordo in the vernacular would come into effect, and the date by which the new ordo, both for masses celebrated in the vernacular and for masses celebrated in Latin, must be used obligatorily, except in cases provided for by law. Regarding the Missal now. 9. The Latin text of the Roman Missal may be used as soon as it comes off the press. 1. The various episcopal conferences will determine the day from which the translations of the new Missal may be used. For this, one can proceed in stages, using the translations as soon as they are approved. It is not necessary to wait until all the texts are translated into the vernacular languages. Some examples follow. 14. The various episcopal conferences will determine the day from which the text of the new Roman Missal, except in cases provided for below, must be used obligatorily. It is advisable, prestant, that this period of time not be extended beyond November 28, 1971. Here, again, the instruction presents no ambiguity. The episcopal conferences have a mandate from the Holy See to determine the date on which the texts of the new Missal will come into use in the vernacular language and the date from which the new Missal, both in Latin and in the vernacular language, will become obligatory for all, except in cases provided for by law. The particular cases provided for by law are as follows. 19. Elderly priests who celebrate privately, sine populo, those who would experience severe difficulties in using the Novus Ordo Missae, the new texts of the Missal or lectionary of the Mass can, with the consent of their ordinary, continue using the current rites and texts. As for special cases, for example, infirm priests, those suffering from a disease or some other difficulty, those will be presented to the congregation for divine worship. Thus, for masses without a congregation, ordinaries, bishops, major superiors of religious, can authorize elderly priests or others who have difficulties to use the Missal of St. Pius V with its old ordo. But for all masses with a congregation, one must appeal to Rome if the infirm priest or the one who is sick or in a particular difficult situation wants to use the Missal of St. Pius V. The instruction of October 20th, 1969 is also signed by Cardinal Gut, prefect. Father Bugnini then replaced Monsignor Antonelli as the secretary of the Congregation for Divine Worship. In France, so this we're discussing the promulgation in France because it's a book from France. In accordance with this instruction, the French episcopate made an ordinance on November 12, 1969. By apostolic mandate, it determined the date of entry into force, permission, of the new books in French and the date on which the new books, both in French and in Latin, would become obligatory thus. 1. The use of the new order, the Novus Ordo Missae, and the corresponding norms is authorized from the first Sunday of Advent, November 30th, 1969. It will become obligatory from January 1st, 1970, except in special cases, etc. The text of the new Missal may be used as soon as they're published. The use will become obligatory from the first Sunday of Advent, 1970. There is no abuse of power in this ordinance. The decisions taken are in accordance with the mandate received from the Apostolic See. However, the predictions regarding the publication of the Latin Missal of Paul VI and its translations proved to be too optimistic. The Latin Missal was promulgated by a decree of the Congregation of Rites, now the Congregation for Divine Worship, dated March 26, 1970. The decree, signed by Cardinal Gut, again specified thus: regarding the use of the new Roman Missal, it is permitted to use the Latin edition as soon as it is published, etc. It is entrusted to the episcopal conferences to prepare the vernacular editions and to determine the date when these will start to come into force after their confirmation by the Apostolic See. Nothing in this decree about the date when the new Missal would become obligatory. This had been sufficiently provided for in the instruction of October 20th, 1969. And the slowness of translation work in some countries did not allow for predicting when the episcopal conferences could make the new Missal obligatory for both Latin and vernacular masses, as they were to do. It became evident that the initially set deadline of November 28, 1971, optative preceded is better, it is more appropriate, cf. supra, was not sufficiently distant for all translations of the entire Missal to be ready and printed by that time in all countries. Therefore, the Congregation for Divine Worship published a notification on June 14, 1971, in which it was stated thus: the Episcopal conferences will ensure that the translation and publication of the country's language of the liturgical books, including the Missal, are completed as soon as possible. However, given the particular difficulties these publications pose, they will determine the day from which the translations approved by them and confirmed by the Apostolic See may or must enter into use, totally or partially. In France, the Order Missal of Paul VI had been obligatory since January 1st, 1970, for Masses in Latin and Masses in French. The French texts of the new Missal already published became obligatory from the first Sunday of Advent, 1970. Those not published at that time subsequently became obligatory as soon as they were published, without the need to draft a new ordinance each time. The entire Latin Missal was also obligatory in France from the first Sunday of Advent, 1970. When the translation work of the Missal was entirely completed, the Episcopal Assembly deemed it appropriate to renew its ordinance, which had been repeatedly and wrongly contested. This was done in Lourdes in November 1974, confirming its previous decision. From the first Sunday of Advent 1974, in the celebration in French, the translations contained in the official French edition of the Roman Missal, promulgated by Paul VI, must replace all previous provisional translations. In cases where the celebration in Latin is anticipated, only the Missal promulgated by Pope Paul VI will be used, with the exceptions of Masses celebrated privately by elderly infirm priests or those who experience severe difficulties in observing the new rite. These, with the permission of their ordinary, can continue to use the Missal of St. Pius V. A new notification from the Congregation for Divine Worship had just been published on October 28, 1974, reminding everyone that when an Episcopal conference made a part of the entirety of the new Missal obligatory, this applied both to celebrations in the vernacular and in Latin, and that permissions granted by ordinaries to elderly priests wishing to continue to use the Missal of St. Pius V could only be granted and used for Masses without a congregation, sine populo. Thus, the reform of Paul VI is not optional. Nothing was lacking in its promulgation, which was done according to the rules and in a perfectly explicit manner. It is no longer legitimate to claim the liturgical forms that were the only legitimate ones before the Council. The Fathers who discussed and voted on the Constitution Sacrosanctum Concilium intended to enact a true reform. They did not merely propose it to those members of the Church who would willingly accept it. They ordered it because they saw it as a good for the Church. No doubt, the Fathers envisioned legitimate pluralism, but within the context of the renewed liturgy, not an alternative between the liturgy of that time and the post-conciliar liturgy. The renewed liturgy of today's Church is substantially in conformity with the provisions made by the Fathers, and we have the Apostolic See as a guarantee, which promulgated this renewed liturgy. It is now the sole liturgy of the Roman Church, whether celebrated in Latin or in the vernacular language. The true thought of Paul VI. But, it is claimed, Paul VI's thinking is at odds with the official acts he signed himself or for which he gave a so-called special mandate to the prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship. This claim is purely gratuitous. To conclude this chapter, here are some words spoken by the Pope to the faithful during audiences he granted in November 1969 and in the summer of 1973. Unless one claims that the Pope speaks continually against his own thought, their testimony cannot be denied. On November 19th, 1969. This imminent reform responds to an official mandate of the Church. It is an act of obedience. It shows that the Church is consistent with itself. It is a step forward in the line of its authentic tradition. It is a proof of fidelity and vitality that requires from all of us a prompt adhesion. It is not an arbitrary decision. It is not a temporary or optional experiment. It is not an innovation due to some dilettante. It is a law, elaborated by eminent liturgists after long discussion and studies. We would do well to welcome it with joyful interest and apply it punctually and unanimously. On November 26, 1969, we must clearly see the reasons why this grave change has been introduced, that is, obedience to the council. The first reason is not simply canonical, in the sense that it would be just an external precept. It is linked to the charism of liturgical action, that is, to the power and efficacy of the Church's prayer, etc. It is the will of Christ. It is the breath of the Holy Spirit that calls the Church to this change. On August 22nd, 1973. It is necessary to apply faithfully, intelligently, and diligently the liturgical reform promoted by the Council and specified by the competent authorities of the Church. Those who prevent or recklessly slow it down lose the providential opportunity for a true renaissance and a happy spread of the Catholic religion in our time. On the other hand, those who take advantage of the reform to engage in arbitrary experiments scatter forces and wound the sense of the Church. The time has come to observe intelligently and unanimously this solemn law of prayer in the Church of God, that is the liturgical reform. Can it still be claimed that Paul VI only reluctantly accepted the liturgical reform, that the new Missal bearing his name was imposed against his will, and that he yielded out of weariness? Or would we have to be able to prove that the clear words just quoted do not really correspond to his thinking? And where would one end up with such assumptions, the gratuitousness of which is only equaled by their incongruity? All right, that's the end of the chapter. Somebody making fun of my reading voices says, right, proper reading, isn't it? Yes. Yes, it is. Give me a second. Drink some of my rum and I'm going to drink some of my coffee. I probably should have just mixed them together, to be honest. I should have just put rum in the coffee. Let's see. The only problem, so this, I have a surprising amount of audience. So right now we're still sitting at 9 on YouTube and 146 on X. I'm going to go check on Twitter, on X, and see what we got going on. For all I know, it could be a total show, because I've never used X for streaming. Do you got it? We do there's a chat on X, but there's only 3. Okay. There's only 3 chats according to what I see on it. Oh, I see why I have an audience, because Christian Wagner's got me here. Is that what he's done? No, he hasn't. That was me. I'm sorry. I thought Christian came in clutch. Well, anyway, he might have. Who knows what's going on? Who knows what's going on with my life? See, also, this is me taking a little break. Resting my voice for a second. I want to at least get through 2 chapters. We are at an hour. Well, we're not really at an hour yet because I putzed around for 30 minutes or so. But I want to get through at least 2 chapters or an hour and a half of reading. I can read up to 2 or 3 hours, but I'm not used to it because it's been a while. Also, and again, for those of you on Twitter, please come over to my YouTube if you want to interact and comment, because I can't keep up with Twitter as well. And if you want to get to that, it's River Run on YouTube. You can get to it by clicking through my profile on Twitter, and or you can just search it up. Because I only have, again, I didn't expect this big an audience on X. I only have 9 people on YouTube, so all questions are totally dominated by 9 people. Somebody going separately drinking rum and cola. Well, no, so to be clear, I've got the coffee and I've got the rum and cola. So, but I mean, if you're saying separately drinking from the coffee, yeah, I probably should just put the rum in the coffee. I probably will when I finish this, to be honest. All right. Let's get ready for the rest. Also, I'm surprised I'm maintaining a good upward trajectory on an audience. This is pretty good. Usually I lose a large selection by now, but I guess, again, people really like this topic and they are hanging in. Okay. Now we're on the question of the abrogation of the old Missal. Chapter 2. Is the Missal of St. Pius V really abrogated? There is no doubt that the Missal of Paul VI was really and canonically promulgated. The legislation is perfectly clear and coherent. It presents no flaws. The objections raised stem either from an incomplete knowledge of the legislative texts or from a misunderstanding of their true nature and scope. The power of the Church. But what would be the value of the exposition contained in the first chapter if it rested on a false premise? Did the Council truly have the right to decide on a revision of the ritual of the Mass of St. Pius V? And could Paul VI, in good conscience, promulgate a new Missal? There exists a fundamental answer often formulated in similar occasions thus: since the Church has done it, it means she has the power to do it. On a matter of this importance, which touches upon faith and the economy of the sacraments, the very foundations on which the Church is built, she is necessarily guaranteed by her charism of infallibility. She benefits from the assistance promised to her by the Lord thus: "And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age," said the Lord to the disciples before leaving them on Matthew 28:20. "The Paraclete and the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all I have said to you," John 14:26. The Church would no longer be the Church if in an act as solemn as an ecumenical council she could err so greatly regarding her essential prerogatives. She would be nothing more than a human society among others, and our faith in her would have no object. Credo, etc., unum sanctum catholicum et apostolicum ecclesiam, I believe, etc., in one holy Catholic and apostolic Church. It is known that what the Church has established, she can also change and abrogate, wrote Pius XII in the Constitution Sacramentum Ordinis of November 30th, 1947, concerning the rites of ordination. Here is the entire passage. If in time the tradition of the instruments, that is to say, the handing over of the chalice containing the wine and the paten containing the bread, was necessary, even for validity by the will and precept of the Church, it is known that what she has established the Church can today change and abrogate. In this regard, the ritual of the Mass is in exactly the same situation as that of ordinations. The exact limits of the Church's power are known to us only through her practice. When she modifies a rite that some consider essential, it is because she has received the necessary powers from her founder to do so. The theologian simply accepts the fact and accounts for it using reason enlightened from above by faith. He does not dispute it, either a priori or a posteriori. Was the Missal of St. Pius V promulgated ne varietur, that is to say, with not allowing variation, not allowing change? This is believed that it was so promulgated wrongly by several proponents of the pre-Reformed liturgy. They rely on the terms of the bull Quo Primum Tempore of St. Pius V, dated July 14th, 1570, to try to prove it thus. We forbid henceforth and in perpetuity, etc., that any other formulae than those conforming to the Missal that we have published be sung or recited, even if one has obtained any kind of dispensation by an indult of the Apostolic See, by the fact of a custom, a privilege, or even an oath, or by apostolic confirmation, etc. The translation of the third page of chapter, reading my own prompt material, excuse me, excise that. However, the Pope accepted those churches which had possessed their own liturgy for more than 200 years. By our present constitution, which shall be valid in perpetuity, we have decided and we order, under penalty of anathema, that for all the other aforementioned churches, the use of their own missals be absolutely and entirely withdrawn and rejected, and that nothing ever be added, removed, or changed in our missal that we have just published. How was the bull of St. Pius V understood by his successors? It suffices to consult the history of the liturgy. The demonstration remains the same, whether the modification is minor or significant. The new edition by Clement VIII on July 7th, 1640, Bull Cum Sanctissimum, corrected the chanted pieces, taking into account the text of the revised Vulgate, whereas the Missal of St. Pius V followed the version of the old antiphonal Missarum. In 1634, through the bull Si Quid Est, Urban VII revised the rubrics to reduce the transfer of impeded feasts. It would be too lengthy to detail all the additions made to the Missal over the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries by the introduction of new feasts not contained in that of St. Pius V, and for good reason, when it concerns saints subsequent to him. But let us move to the contemporary era. The liturgical reform of St. Pius X, although partial, had its repercussions on the Missal. Already the bull Divino Efflatu of November 1st, 1911, and the Constitution Ab Hinc Duos Annos of October 23rd, 1913, brought a number of minor modifications to the celebration of the Mass. The whole was codified in the Editiones et Variationes in Rubricis Missalis, published by Benedict XV on July 25th, 1920, in the new typical edition of the Missal. The latest in the line of typical editions is that of John the 23rd in 1962, which incorporates the modifications of his new code of rubrics. Then came the Council. The Breviary and Missal are living books that evolve, grow, or simplify according to the needs of the Church, whose responsible authority is the final judge. No pope has ever felt bound in his legislative power by the prohibitions contained in the bull of St. Pius V. These prohibitions only withdrew from the ordinaries of the Latin Church any right to add or modify the liturgy without the express authorization of the Holy See, which henceforth was constituted as the sole legislator in this domain. What exactly is the Missal of Paul VI, if not that of St. Pius V, adapted, enriched, completed? If one were to undertake a line-by-line comparison, one would find in the Missal of Paul VI 3/4, if not 9/10 of the content of the original Missal of St. Pius V. This has been complained about. He means in the ordo. So somebody, I remember this came up on the new liturgical movement, it comes up rhetorically. The claim, he said, what do you mean 3/4 of the Missal of Paul of the Missal of Pius V is in the Missal of Paul VI? He means the ordo. He means if you sat the ordinary of the Mass next to the ordinary of the Old Mass, it's 3/4. 3/4 to 9/10, the same. Especially if you go option one the whole way down. Do you want to add weight to the demonstration by comparing the pontifical texts concerning not the Missal but the Breviary? 2 years before promulgating the revised Missal, St. Pius V had indeed reformed the Breviary, which he presented in the bull Quod an Nobis of July 7th, 1568, whose wording strangely echoes what has just been cited thus. We order that our breviary and form of praying and psalming be observed in all churches of the entire world, monasteries, orders, and places except exempt, where the office must or is accustomed to be said according to the use of the Roman Church, except for the aforementioned institutions or custom exceeding 200 years. Stating that this breviary at no time can be changed in whole or in part, that nothing can be added to or taken away from it, and that those who are bound by right or by custom to recite or psalm the canonical hours according to the use and right of the Roman Church, etc., are henceforth and perpetually expressly obliged to recite and psalm the hours both of the day and of the night, in accordance with the prescription and form of this Roman breviary, and that none of those to whom this duty is formally imposed can satisfy it except in this single form. A similar interpretation was given to these clauses, apparently exclusive of any progress and evolution. Judge for yourself. The promulgation of the breviary dates from 1568. 34 years later, a new corrected edition of this breviary was published, promulgated by the bull Cum Ecclesia of Clement VIII, May 10th, 1602. The new edition brought numerous modifications to the entire breviary. Firstly, the Psalter now followed the revised version of the Vulgate according to the 1598 edition. Quite a number of Matins readings had been corrected. The general rubrics had been retouched. In addition, some minor modifications were made in the antiphons, responsories, and other pieces. In 1632, a new corrected edition of the breviary, that of Urban VIII, was published. Once again, the readings were revised and corrected, but the most significant overall modification was the introduction of the hymnary, which had been almost entirely rewritten. This hymnary was imposed on all who used the Roman breviary, and the old one was preserved only in some particular liturgies. One cannot omit to mention the new edition of St. Pius X. It fundamentally alters the distribution of psalms among the hours of the office. St. Pius V had written thus: "This breviary, at no time, may be changed in whole or in part." St. Pius X decided thus: "By the authority of these present letters, all above, we abolish the arrangement of the Psalter as it currently is in the Roman breviary, and we absolutely forbid its use from the calends of January of the year 1913. Thus, since St. Pius V, the sovereign pontiffs have not hesitated to change significantly. Consider the editions of Urban VIII and St. Pius X, the breviary of 1568. No pope has felt bound by the clause of aliquid addendum, and no one has thought to this day to evade obedience by accusing them of laying impious hands on the so-called untouchable work of St. Pius V. What one pope has done, another can do." Is the Missal of St. Pius V really abrogated? In a certain respect, this is also defunct, because the use of the Missal of St. Pius V, at least its 1962 edition, is now regulated very particularly. But we'll keep doing it. Also, give me a second. All right. In the Bull of Promulgation, St. Pius V explicitly declared that he was abolishing and forbidding the use of other missals than his, while reserving the right of particular liturgies that were more than 2 centuries old. However, there is nothing similar in the Apostolic Constitution of Paul VI. He merely promulgates his missal without prescribing anything. There are several reasons for this. First, the terminology used by St. Pius V is specific to his time. Then, Pope Paul VI allows for the use of the old missal for elderly priests who request it from their ordinary for masses without a congregation, see especially supra. Furthermore, the rite of St. Pius V is authorized in some exceptional circumstances, even for masses with a congregation, provided that permission has been sought and obtained from the Congregation for Divine Worship. Thus, in 1972, 2 authorizations were granted for the Mass of St. Pius V in England, under the condition of avoiding any risk of division among the faithful. To a similar request made in France by the Schola Saint Grégoire du Mans, the response was, This question must be submitted to the ordinary of the diocese, to whose pastoral prudence it will belong to judge whether it is opportune to authorize the celebration of a Mass according to the unreformed Roman Missal, all danger of dissension and trouble in the community of the faithful being averted. Another decisive reason is that the obligatory nature of the new Mass entails ipso facto the abandonment of the old Missal. The decrees and instruction of the Congregation for Divine Worship have indicated, by special mandate of the Pope, the deadlines within which this obligation falls on every priest. That is, those are to be decided by the episcopal conferences. A final reason is found in the very principles of law as set out in Canons 22 and 23 of the Code. There is an abrogation of law when a new law comes into being that suppresses all or part of the previous law. The new law may expressly state that it abrogates the old one. In this case, the revocation is express, but this is not necessary. The new law often simply makes provisions incompatible with the old law. There is then a tacit and implicit revocation. Because the will of the legislator is necessarily that of the old law, be suppressed to the extent that it is incompatible with the new. There's an abrogation of a previous law when the subsequent law, carried by the competent authority, A, expressly states it, B, is directly contrary to it, C, entirely reorders the matter of the first law. The law promulgating the Missal of Paul VI, which reorders the entirety of the matter of the Missal of St. Pius V, necessarily entails the abrogation of the law that promulgated the Missal of 1570. However, the legislator may grant indults maintaining in force the Missal of St. Pius V, and thus dispensing from the obligation to use the new Missal for certain people in certain circumstances. This is precisely what has been done, as we have just seen. Does the Missal of St. Pius V now fall under customary law? So this is still a live argument that people make. And I'm sorry that I intend to go through the whole book because it might be useful to different people. But I have tried to indicate those sections of the book which are kind of dead or mostly dead, because these first two chapters they're important because you still see the procedural arguments made, but they're not really what people care about. What people really care about are the doctrinal arguments, which don't start, I think, until chapter 3 or 4. Does the Missal of St. Pius V now fall under customary law? In promulgating his Missal, St. Pius V had expressly respected particular liturgies that could claim autonomous existence for 2 centuries. He abolished any liturgical form that could claim an indult, custom, privilege, apostolic confirmation, or any other regular permission, quote, unless the custom or permission had been observed in a church by the celebration of masses for more than 200 years, end quote. Now, the liturgy of St. Pius V has been observed in the Catholic Church for 400 years. Has it not thereby acquired a customary right? Moreover, the Code of Canon Law at the time of its promulgation in 1917 declared that when a custom contrary to the provisions of the Code and enjoying possession of 100 years, whether it concerns the universal church or a particular community, region, diocese, human group, had not been expressly disproved by the Code, it, quote, could be tolerated if the ordinaries take into account the circumstances of place and persons, judge that it is not possible to abolish them, end quote. Canon 5. The use of the Missal of St. Pius V was not expressly disapproved by the Apostolic Constitution of Paul VI. Therefore, it is authorized by virtue of a possession of 400 years. Oh, yeah, by virtue of possession of 400 years. That's the argument. So again, what is the argument? According to the standing thinking about custom, the argument goes, the use of the Missal of St. Pius V was not expressly disapproved by the Apostolic Constitution of Paul VI. Therefore, it is authorized by virtue of a possession of 400 years. That's the argument. In response to this, It will be said that the maintenance of a custom contrary to the code never depends solely on those concerned. It can be tolerated. The legislator's wish is to see it disappear. However, he admits that temporarily it can be left in use if, for local or personal reasons related to the common good, its disappearance would present more disadvantages than advantages. It is understood that the maintenance will last only as long as the reasons of person or place seem to require. It is better that the ordinary make known his thought. His silence, however, can be considered as a sign of tolerance of the customary practice. But the promulgation of a new law does not transform the old one, that of St. Pius V, into a, quote, immemorial, end quote, custom. A custom is a normative rule or objective law introduced by the usage of the community with the consent of the legislator. It is very precisely distinguished from the law. It is often defined as, quote, sit sine scripto. It is therefore of a different species from written law, and a written law that has been abrogated cannot become a custom. The custom comes not from the legislator, like the law, but from the community. The legislator merely giving legal value to a practice spontaneously observed by the community. The observance of the custom is based on the tacit consent of the members, consent that is manifested by a uniform and constant practice. The liturgy of St. Pius V cannot in any case be assimilated to a universal custom existing at the time of the promulgation of the Code of Canon Law. An argument has been put forward thus. The liturgy of St. Pius V is not at present a custom. It can become one, and, not being expressly disproved by the law, it is reasonable and can derogate from an ecclesiastical law not endowed with the clause prohibiting future customs, Canon 27. The response is not difficult. For the establishment of a custom, a true community is needed, the same one that would be capable of being the subject of a law. An individual or individuals without a legal link between them do not form a community. It is necessary that the customary usage has a reasonable character, and it does not have it if the legislator officially or unofficially makes known that he does not accept it. It is not necessary that the usage has been practiced for a sufficient time without raising difficulties. Excuse me, I'm going to knock my keyboard halfway across the room. Under the risk of confusing absolutely primary notions, it is not possible to equate a law that has just been abrogated with an immemorial custom that it would be lawful to keep. If it were otherwise, the legislator would have legislated in vain. Moreover, to be perfectly logical with themselves, those who claim in the name of the bull pro primum tempore to preserve for their personal use the liturgy of St. Pius V should use editions prior to that of Clement VIII, the first pope to have introduced modifications, and refrain from celebrating the numerous feasts introduced in the liturgy since 1568 to 1570, such as the Immaculate Conception, the Sacred Heart, Christ the King, and others less important, etc. The permanent indult of St. Pius V? If certain faithful cannot claim under customary law the maintenance for their use of the liturgy of St. Pius V, do priests not have the unconditional right to celebrate according to the Missal of 1570? This seems to emerge clearly from the very terms of the bull, quo primum tempore. This section is now certainly, after Traditionis Custodes, totally invalid. But we will still discuss it. Well, we'll read it. I don't know if we'll discuss it because none of you want to ask questions. We grant and accord with apostolic authority by the tenor of these present letters that the Missal may be used freely and lawfully for masses, whether sung or recited, in any church whatsoever, without any scruple of conscience and without incurring any penalty, sentence, or censure, and that it can be validly used freely and lawfully in perpetuity. And in a similar manner, we have decided and declare that the superiors, administrators, canons, chaplains, and other priests, by whatever name they may be designated, or religious of any order, cannot be obliged to celebrate Mass in any other way than as we have determined, and that never and at no time can anyone compel and force them to abandon this missal or to abrogate this present instruction or to modify it, but that it shall always remain in effect and valid in all its force, notwithstanding earlier decisions in apostolic constitutions and ordinances. This so-called inalienable privilege bears a striking resemblance to the argument drawn from the Ne Veritor fixation of the Roman Missal by St. Pius V. In any case, the use that is claimed to be made of it is entirely new, so-called unheard of, in the etymological sense of the term. Firstly, it has never been applied to priests belonging to the Eastern rites despite its seemingly universal appearance, whatever they celebrate. These priests are bound by canon law to conform to their own liturgical books. The privilege has also never been applied to Latin priests belonging to a particular rite, such as Mozarabic, Milanese, Latino-Slavic, Lyonese, Carthusian, Dominican, Carmelite of the Grand Order, etc. This is explicitly stated in the Code at Canon 818. Any contrary custom being disapproved, the celebrating priest must carefully and devoutly observe the rubrics of his liturgical books and must not add other ceremonies or prayers of his own choice. Canon 819 can also be invoked. The sacrifice of the Mass must be celebrated in the liturgical language of each rite approved by the Church. Therefore, when a priest belonged to a specific rite, Latin or Eastern, he did not have the option, except by indult of the Holy See, to adopt the Roman books. He had to conform to the books of his rite, even if he preferred the Mass of St. Pius V. As for Latin priests of the Roman Rite, the Holy See has on several occasions asked them to celebrate Mass differently than is determined by St. Pius V, and no one to date thought to invoke the supposed privilege to evade obedience. The prayers prescribed by Leo XIII after the last Gospel, who refused them in the name of the prayers prescribed by Leo XIII after the last Gospel, who refused them in the name of St. Pius V's indult. The liturgy of the Holy 3 Days, established by Pius XII in 1956, who refused it in the name of St. Pius V's indult. That's the liturgy of the Holy Triduum. It just happened to translate it while I wasn't looking. Those who observe the Roman Rite, it was stated in the decree, are henceforth obliged to observe the Ordo of Holy Week as it is in the typical Vatican edition. It was not necessary to wait 4 centuries to assert this alleged privilege. It is too late now, as the statute of limitations has been applied. Its true meaning, however, was that no authority lower than that of the sovereign pontiff could prescribe to a priest of the Roman Rite to celebrate Mass differently than St. Pius V had determined. But he himself or his successors had the possibility to determine something else. The proof is that they do so. And all Christians, all priests until 1969 found this perfectly normal. It is necessary to specify in conclusion that the promulgation of a new order Missal does not imply any depreciation, any condemnation of the old one. The Mass of St. Pius V has not been condemned any more than the Church has condemned in the past the liturgy of St. Damasus, St. Gelasius, St. Gregory the Great, Innocent III. Simply, it has declared that the Missal of St. Pius V no longer constitutes today, except in exceptional cases, the norm of its prayer. At the end of this path, so picturesque, so charming, so frequented in the past, it has placed a no-entry sign. That is all. But if it does not at all intend to so-called condemn the Missal of St. Pius V, that would be absurd. It would contradict itself. It can penalize those who use it improperly, just as a traffic officer fines or issues a ticket to someone who takes the wrong way on a road that has become no entry. Also, there was a footnote on this page that I translated because it was of length. It has sometimes been said that St. Pius V so-called canonized the ritual of the Mass he promulgated after the revision he made to the Roman Missal, just as the canonization of a saint engages in fallibility, and it is not possible to decanonize him. The Order Missal is not subject to a decanonization. This is playing with words. That is, to canonize a saint is to declare, engaging in fallibility, that a faithful person is certainly part of the triumphant church and should be publicly honored. To canonize a ritual is to make it a rule, canon, for the church, and to declare by a decision of disciplinary order that it must be used by all. But a discipline can change, and necessarily changes in the long life of the church. The judgment made by St. Pius V guaranteed the perfect orthodoxy of the ritual of the Mass used by the Roman Church, and decided that all should conform to this order, unless belonging to a rite other than the Roman rite. The judgment made by Paul VI guarantees the perfect orthodoxy of the renewed ritual of the Mass, in accordance with the decisions of the Council, and decides that all must conform to this order, unless belonging to a rite other than the Roman rite, or benefiting from a particular permission granted by the Holy See. Okay, so now we're at, I don't know what I should do. So we got through what I would call the legal or procedural section of the book. And now we're at the doctrinal section. And I don't know, I feel like I should probably break here because we've been going a little over an hour. I feel like we should probably break here and come back and start fresh here, maybe in the morning. I don't know if anybody is here or paying any attention to agree with me, but maybe in the morning or maybe around noon or something. Does anybody have any opinion? I don't know. Oh, also, I see how this works. So X doesn't, I don't think I have. So X says I have 179 viewers, but I think what I have is 179 views, which is very different. Okay. So I bet I've probably been operating with more or less 10 viewers the whole time. That's probably about right. Okay. So in that case, because the stat over here makes it look like I have 180 viewers looking at this all the time, which is not right. Because I would have a lot more interaction. So what I'm going to say is, because I guess Twitter doesn't have live viewers. What I'm going to say is, let's break here and I'll come back. I'm going to schedule it for 10 in the morning. Oh, do I want to do that? It is noon. It is midnight. There's plenty of time. I'm going to schedule it for 10 in the morning and I'll come back and we will get through. No, I'm not. Somebody said, Tristan says tomorrow evening. Well, no, because if I go over to Twitter, it says I have 172 views. 172 views is not viewers. That's very different. I was very excited that we had 180 live viewers. We do not have 180 live viewers. What I'm going to say is, let's come back in the morning or at 10, and I will continue the doctrinal section. And then I'll try to make at least 2 chapters in the doctrinal section, and then maybe the last part of the book on a third, or maybe I'll complete the whole thing tomorrow. That's possible. But I don't think I'm going to, because this was a very tedious section, and I want to break it up so that if somebody just wants to do the doctrinal part, they can come back and they'll deal with the doctrinal part. Also, I'm hoping that if I start tomorrow in the morning, that I'll get some more people. Well, I'm sorry you have Tenebrae in the morning. Oh, do I have Tenebrae tomorrow? Well, they didn't tell me to do it. But I'm going to say that we should come back tomorrow, and hopefully some people who are doctrinally interested and awake and active will be ready to go tomorrow. That's my hope. All right, so let's end it now. I'm going to retitle this part 1 on the YouTube archive, and then we'll come back tomorrow. All right, I appreciate all of you, and see you tomorrow.